Hello, and welcome to Unit 6. Now that we know the basics of econometrics, now that we can understand what a linear model is and how to interpret it, and now that we know how to conduct some statistical testing, our job now is to figure out how do we actually create a model from scratch. How do we actually choose the variables that we're going to have in our model? We saw a little bit of this in Chapter 3, when we decided that usually the question we're trying to answer establishes what the dependent variable is. But there is sometimes very little guidance about how we choose the independent variables. And we're going to be looking in this chapter about how we go about doing that. We're also going to be deciding on what kind of functional form we're going to have in our model. So far, the only models we have covered are linear models, but there are other kinds of models that might be more appropriate for the kind of data we're looking at. And we're also going to see what happens when we make a mistake choosing the form of the stochastic error. So far, the only kind of error that we have is the classical error, the one that is normally distributed. We're going to see what happens when that classical assumption actually doesn't hold. We're going to use 4 guidelines to try to come up with models that are good. The first one is going to be the theory. The theory and our research is going to establish what kind of dependent variables and independent variables are commonly used in our kind of research. Then we're going to be using the t-test to figure out whether a model should include a variable or not. We're also going to look at the caveats of relying too much on the t-test. We're also going to be looking at the coefficient of determination, or the R-square, to decide between competing models what model is better than the other. And finally, we're going to see what could happen if we actually encounter some bias. That is, if we don't add a variable that should have been in the model, or if we add a variable that shouldn't have been in the model. That's what we call problems with a specification. In this chapter, we're going to be looking at 2. First one is the so-called omitted variable. This is a variable that is important to have to explain the dependent variable, but for whatever reason, we don't include it. Either it's impossible to be obtained, it's impossible to measure, or we simply forgot. In that situation, we're going to be looking at a problem called omitted variable bias. I'll explain to you what that omitted variable is in this unit. The other problem that I mentioned is the problem of pretty much throwing everything into the sink. We call that the irrelevant variables problem. Now, that doesn't cause bias, as the previous problem does, but it creates another problem called the decrease in the precision of our estimates. In the last part of this unit, we're going to be looking at some practices that some economists use to come up with good models. One of them is what's called specification searches, which is either start with a very basic model and start including variables, or start with a big model and start eliminating variables. So we're going to see what the pros and the cons of those kind of specification searches are. Then we're going to be looking at sensitivity analysis. This pretty much means to include variables into a model and see what happens to the other ones. And lastly, we're going to be looking at a problem called data mining. I can always come up with any kind of model if you give me any data set. So the question is, do we want a model that can explain the particular data set in hand, or do we want a model that can actually be used to explain reality outside of the specified model?